All right, are y'all ready to start? All right. Oran, I'll let you go ahead and kick us off.
All right, this is the Faith and Family Forum, so I'll start with the first word, faith. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your faith, what it means to you, and how it's had an impact in your life.
Well, sure. Oran, thank you very much. Thank you for your leadership here in the state of South Carolina. Thank you for standing and defending our faith and values. And Alan, thank you so much for your strong leadership as Attorney General, unapologetically defending the principles, the values, the Judeo-Christian values that built this country. I'm really proud to join both of you at this forum, and I'm so proud to be back at Bob Jones, be here with so many good friends, and thank you for your being here and investing the time and the seriousness with which you approach the political process. Your question about faith, I'm a Christian, and my faith is integral to who I am. My testimony, I've shared a number of times, actually begins when I was a little boy. My parents were not Christians, and we were living up in Canada at the time. You may have heard that. And both of them had a real drinking problem. And when I was 3 years old, my father left my mother and me. And he went down to Texas, and he decided he didn't want to be married anymore. He didn't want to be a dad to his 3-year-old son. And my mom and I, we moved into an apartment together. And my dad spent several months down in Houston, and a colleague of his from work invited him to a Bible study. And he went to the Bible study. And what really struck him is at the end of the Bible study, there was a time of prayer, and people were sharing prayer requests. And everyone there had challenges. He remembers one woman in particular who talked about how her son would beat her in order to get money to buy drugs. And what my father couldn't understand is that everyone there, even though they had those challenges, they had a peace in their life. What the Word calls a peace that passes understanding. And he didn't know where that came from, but he knew he didn't have it. And he wanted it. And when he was leaving, the hosts of the Bible study, they gave him a copy of the pamphlet, The Four Spiritual Laws. And they said, why don't you read this and come back next week? And so he came back the next week. And they said, did you read the pamphlet? And he said, yeah, but it can't be that easy. That's just too easy. That can't possibly be it. And he continued asking questions. They said, I'll tell you what, our pastor's coming by the house tomorrow. Why don't you come join us and you can ask the pastor those questions? So he came back the next night. About 7 o'clock at night, he spent 4 hours arguing with the pastor. My dad, he was young, he was a scientist, he was brilliant, but he was an atheist, and he was convinced he was going to disprove all of this. And then finally, about 11 o'clock at night, my dad asked the pastor, he said, all right, well, what about the man in Tibet who's never heard of Jesus? What about him? And the pastor, his name was Galen Wiley, he very wisely said, Raphael, I don't know about the man in Tibet, but you've heard of Jesus. What's your excuse? And that it hit my dad like a ton of bricks. And he fell to his knees and he gave his life to Jesus. And the next Sunday he was baptized, and he drove to the airport, he bought a plane ticket, he flew back to my mother and me. And it reunited our family. And if it were not for the loving salvation of Jesus, I would have been raised by a single mom without my dad in the house. Instead, our family was reunited. Some months later, my mother became a Christian as well. And then for me, I became a Christian when I was 8 years old. We became members of that church where that pastor was. It was Clay Road Baptist Church. And they had a summer youth camp that my cousin and I both went to. And when I was 8 years old, I gave my life to Jesus at that summer youth camp. And I am saved by grace, and it has transformed my life and my family's life.
Thank you.
Senator, Oran kicked it off with using the word faith. And when we think of faith, what I think of, especially during this season, faith has become a taboo word in modern American politics. If you talk about your faith, if you invoke the name of Christ, or if you invoke any type of religious parable or anything like that, you're viewed a certain way. And I would like to see faith become mainstream in our government. But even though faith has been kind of pushed out of the mainstream of modern politics, you look at what happened last summer in Charleston, South Carolina. I believe personally that it was faith and forgiveness through that faith of the murderer who murdered 9 people, that when the family members came out and forgave him. I think that is partly the reason why in South Carolina we did not see a lot of the attacks and the riots and the chaos that ensued in other areas of the country when other similar type tragic events occurred. So my question to you, because faith was such a unifying factor here, as president, what role would your faith play in breaking down the political, religious, racial, economic divisions that divide so many Americans?
Well, Alan, thank you for that question. Look, my faith is integral to who I am. And actually, you're right, that tragic shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church provided a powerful illustration of how faith can bring us together. And it also was a real missed opportunity for the president. One of the saddest things of the last 7 years of the Obama presidency is at every turn, it seems, the president tries to divide us, tries to separate us on racial lines, on ethnic lines, on socioeconomic lines, on religious lines, tries to pit us against each other. And I think we should have a president who works to unify us, on our shared values. And instead of politicizing that horrible tragedy, listen, as a Christian, the idea of someone coming into a church, spending an hour praying with people, and then pulling out a gun and murdering 9 other people who you've just been praying with, that's a level of evil and depravity. It's very hard to even get your mind around that level of evil. And yet the next day when the families stood up and said, "We forgive you," what an incredible Christian testimony of love and forgiveness. And imagine how different it would have been if instead of playing political games with it, instead of trying to push gun control and politicize it as the president always does, if he'd simply stood up and highlighted those families and said that there will always be evil in the world. But that hate, that bigotry, that racism, that murderous rage we saw yesterday, that's not who America is. You want to know who America is? It is the love and forgiveness of these moms and dads and sisters and brothers and sons and daughters who lost their loved one and said, in spite of your hate, in the spirit of Jesus, we forgive you. That's who we are, and I wish the president would highlight that and bring us together instead of trying to divide us.
I want to pivot from faith to the Supreme Court. And you know a little bit about the Supreme Court. You've been to that building once or twice in your life. So it's kind of a 3-part question. One is we have 9 Supreme Court justices on the court. I know that you've worked for one in the past. And I'm sure people here would like to know what kind of Supreme Court justice you would seek to emulate or want emulated on the Supreme Court. If you have a favorite or one that you might not have to be your favorite. And the other one is I would like for these folks to hear which Supreme Court case or decision that has come out that you disagree with the most. That's a 2-part question. Before you answer that, everyone here has already known, because they've heard me talk about this, that nearly half of the Supreme Court justices were born in the 1930s, meaning the next president could appoint up to or more than half the Supreme Court, depending on how many terms they serve, which could leave a long-lasting impact on our government that will last long time from now. So my question to you is, what types of individuals would you appoint, and what kind of questions would you ask or want to know the answers to before you allow them to go to the court?
Well, Alan, thank you for that question. As you know, you and I have both had lifelong passions defending the Constitution and defending the Bill of Rights. My entire adult life has been fighting to defend the Constitution. And there are few, if any, questions more important for the next president than what kind of justice he or she will put on the court. Because the next president's going to get 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 Supreme Court justices, and we are one justice away from a radical 5-justice liberal majority, the likes of which this country's never seen. And so there were several parts of your question. One part of the question is, what justices do I admire most? Of the current justices, I would say two. I would say Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, both of whom are remarkable men. I know both quite well, and they are principled constitutionalists who follow the law. And I would say of a former justice, my former boss, Chief Justice William Rehnquist. I spent a year as a law clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist. He was an extraordinary, principled, conservative constitutionalist. In terms of decisions that I disagree with, that could take quite a while.
Pick one.
But I'm going to pick actually two. I think in modern times, the two greatest tragedies from the court, there are many wrong decisions, but the two greatest tragedies were Roe versus Wade and the gay marriage decision. And both of them share a pattern. With Roe, you had a handful of unelected judges decreeing a right to abortion that is found nowhere in the Constitution, and the consequences of that has been that over 50 million children never got to breathe a breath of air, never got to play in a backyard, never got to live their hopes and dreams. And then the gay marriage decision was 5 unelected judges inventing a right nowhere in the Constitution, ignoring the text of the Constitution, and purporting to tear down the marriage laws of all 50 states. If you want to think about the next president, a critical question is, who do you trust on Supreme Court justices? You know, if you look at, it's great to be back at Bob Jones. The last time I was on this stage was we hosted a religious liberty rally. And it was incredible. We had about 3,000 people here in defense of religious liberty, and we listened to heroes who had stood for their faith and been persecuted, one after the other, and it was inspirational, it was uplifting. If you want to see it, the whole thing's on our website. It's at tedcruz.org. But the whole purpose of the rally was the media diminishes these threats to religious liberty. And so the rally was to hear from ordinary people, a baker, a florist, a T-shirt maker, a soldier, a fireman, how they stood for their faith, and when faced with a choice, give in to the government or stand with God, they made the decision to stand with God, and they were fired from their jobs, they were persecuted, they paid fines. Religious liberty is a fundamental commitment of this country. And to give you a sense of the level of the stakes, before I was in the Senate, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, which is the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I held that executive post for 5.5 years. And we led the country defending conservative principles and winning nationally. And some of the victories we had there are particularly relevant to thinking about the direction this court goes. One of the bigger cases we had is we defended the Ten Commandments monument that stands on the state capitol grounds. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court and we won 5-4. We are one justice away from the Supreme Court ordering Ten Commandments monuments torn down from courthouses and city halls and any public display anywhere in the country. Another major victory of ours is we brought together 31 states defending the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and we won 5-4. We are one justice away from the Supreme Court concluding that no individual here has any individual right to keep and bear arms whatsoever, that the federal government can ban firearms, can make it a crime for any American to own a gun, and there's no Second Amendment right to challenge it and do anything about it. We're one justice away. We are one justice away. Another case we did, we brought a group of states together defending the federal ban on partial birth abortions. We won that 5-4. We are one justice away from the Supreme Court mandating unlimited abortion on demand up till the moment of birth, partial birth with taxpayer funding, and no parental notification. One justice. And a final example, when I was in private practice, I represented over 3 million veterans defending the Mojave Desert Veterans Memorial, which is a lone white Latin cross that was erected over 70 years ago to honor the men and women who gave their lives in World War I. The ACLU sued, arguing you cannot display a cross on public land. The district court agreed, the Court of Appeals agreed, And I represented over 3 million veterans defending that Veterans Memorial. We won 5-4. We are one justice away from the Supreme Court ordering veterans memorials torn down all over this country, and we're not far from the court ordering the chisels to come out to remove the crosses and stars of David on the tombstones of fallen soldiers. You want to talk about the face of this country, about losing our rights for a generation. We get this election wrong, and our constitutional rights will be lost for a generation. And here's the reality of court nominations. Democrats always get it right. They always appoint the people that will vote exactly as they want in every major case over and over and over again. Republicans, we bat about 500. Many of the worst judicial activists, Earl Warren, Bill Brennan, John Paul Stevens, David Souter, Harry Blackmun, the author of Roe versus Wade, every one of those was a Republican appointee. And the reason is too many Republicans don't care about the court. They're not willing to spend the political capital to nominate and confirm a proven conservative constitutionalist. They go for the easy choice, the stealth choice, with no paper trail. If we end up seeing a President Hillary Clinton, or frankly, a Republican president who hasn't demonstrated a lifetime commitment to defending the Constitution, I think the odds are unacceptably high we will see our rights torn down for a generation. And I give you my solemn word, every justice I put on the court will be a principled constitutionalist who will be faithful to the law and who will not legislate from the bench.
Those in the audience who have been with us all day will realize that at this point you just covered an entire page of my questions. Let me do a little follow-up, though.
The NSA had intercepted them, so I read them earlier.
You read them earlier.
Are they on your server at your house?
Yeah.
Actually, I used Hillary's server.
Yeah. Nothing like surveillance. One of the methods or tools for dealing with the Obergefell threat to religious freedom is to pass a law. And the proposed law that most of the South Carolina legislative delegation, congressional delegation, is supporting is called the First Amendment Defense Act. What do you think of that strategy? Would you make that a priority if you were president? Would you do it in your first 100 days? Thoughts on FADA?
Absolutely, yes. I am a sponsor of it. I'm a strong supporter of it. In the wake of the gay marriage decision, I introduced a constitutional amendment to restore the authority of state legislatures to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. I introduced legislation stripping the federal courts of jurisdiction over challenges to marriage. And indeed, I publicly called for judicial retention elections for Supreme Court justices. If they're going to behave like politicians, they need to be accountable to the men and women of this country.
You can clap.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
One of the, I always have trouble, amicus or amicus?
Either one.
Yeah. I took just enough Latin to get confused.
Potato.
Yeah, potato. The amicus brief that was written by 37 Protestant theologians, that was actually written by 4 South Carolina attorneys from here down near Columbia on the Hobby Lobby case.
Yeah.
The other case that the Attorney General's office wrote a magnificent amicus brief on was Town of Greece, which came out of some South Carolina cases and other cases. So, and you've covered the Second Amendment. How about opining on Hobby Lobby and Town of Greece?
Well, listen, as I mentioned, religious liberty for me has been a passion. I have 2 decades of personal history fighting to defend religious liberty. In the Hobby Lobby case, I filed an amicus brief as well as a sitting senator defending religious liberty. And Hobby Lobby was a tremendous victory for religious liberty, but it was 5-4. We're one justice away from the Supreme Court concluding that the federal government under Obamacare can force any one of us to violate our faith, and we have no right to challenge that. And, you asked as president what I would do. I've pledged on the first day in office to do 5 things. One of those 5 is I intend to instruct the Department of Justice and the IRS and every federal agency that the persecution of religious liberty ends today. And you know, one of the consequences, we all understand that Barack Obama has abused his power in many, many ways, and his favorite way of doing it is abusing executive authority and executive power. The silver lining of that is everything done with executive power can be undone with executive power.
That's right.
That's why I pledged on the very first day in office to rescind every single illegal and unconstitutional executive action taken by Barack Obama.
I covered your page.
Yeah.
It's why I pledged to direct the Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood and to prosecute any criminal violations.
You're answering all our questions.
Well, and on religious liberty, you know, another case that was right side by side with Hobby Lobby is the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Which is continuing.
It is continuing. So right now today, the Obama administration is litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic charity, trying to impose millions of dollars of fines on the sisters under Obamacare in order to try to force them to pay for abortion-inducing drugs and others. He is a dangerous, dangerous president. Now, as I have joked many times, a really good rule of thumb, if you're litigating against nuns, you've probably done something wrong. And so in January 2017, the Little Sisters of the Poor will find that the case against them has been dismissed.
So y'all are going to notice we're skipping questions because he's covering the answers. You don't look at that. I don't know. But real quick, 10th Amendment. I'm a 10th Amendment guy. We got a lot of 10th Amendment people out here, but unfortunately, there are so many people who don't understand the Constitution. If it's not listed in the Constitution, it goes to the states. That's the whole principle of the 10th Amendment. But we've got a lot of unelected bureaucrats ruling through administrative fiat and this alphabet soup of federal agencies. They just don't get it. They're violating separation of powers. They're not staying in their lane. What kind of vetting questions would you ask, or what kind of people would you put in charge of these agencies, like the EPA, the NLRB, the Department of Justice, or any of the other plethora of alphabet soup agencies in the federal government?
Well, let me say, Alan, on this question, to quote the movie Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello.
I knew that's coming.
When it comes to the 10th Amendment, this has been a passion of mine literally going back from when I was a teenager. When I was in high school, I got involved with a nonprofit organization in Houston where we studied the Constitution and actually memorized the Constitution in short and mnemonic form, and then toured the state of Texas speaking about the Constitution. In college, I wrote my senior thesis in college on the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. Before I was in the Senate, I led the Center for 10th Amendment Studies at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And when I was Solicitor General, what we were best known for is leading the fight for states' rights, leading the fight for the 10th Amendment for 5.5 years from the state of Texas, often standing side by side with South Carolina. Texas and South Carolina have been in many battles, arm in arm and side by side.
That is true. I can attest to that.
And you know,
well, Texans are just transplanted South Carolinians.
Well, that's true.
Right?
And we are grateful for the gift of liberty. You know, if you look at the 10th Amendment, it's a basic protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. Now, that means there are certain responsibilities the federal government needs to do and do well. It needs to protect this nation, keep this country safe. That means we need to rebuild the military, and we need to defeat radical Islamic terrorism. It means we need to secure the borders and end sanctuary cities. But there are a whole bunch of other areas the federal government's not got no business sticking its nose. Chief among those is education. Under the 10th Amendment, education is a question for the states. So on day one, I intend to instruct the Federal Department of Education that Common Core ends today. And the reason you can do that is because it's executive power that Obama is abusing to try to force Common Core on the states. They're using race to the top funds to try to blackmail or extort the states into adopting it. That can end with a stroke of a pen, but I'll tell you what ought to happen. What ought to happen is we should abolish the Department of Education.
Next, and these are questions that I've asked earlier. I sued the federal government again this week on their failure to live up to their agreement under the National Defense Authorization Act, where they said, South Carolina, take the nuclear waste. We said, no, we don't want your nuclear waste. They said, well, you take it, we'll build you a processing facility to process it so it's not dangerous and can be de-weaponized, or we'll take it off your hands and we'll pay you the money for your troubles. They've done none of those things. We've filed suit. Two-part question. The first part is, what would you do to ensure that states like South Carolina don't get stuck with nuclear waste illegally? Okay, not to where it should go, but the fact that they're violating the laws, number one. Number two, this is a short one, Gitmo. We're one of 3 states where the Obama administration has discussed putting the terrorists from Guantanamo Bay here at the Naval Brig in South Carolina, in Charleston. So I would be interested to know what your positions are on those.
Yeah. So look, the first question, when it comes to nuclear waste, I think the people of a state should have a say in whether nuclear waste comes to their state or not. If a state wants it, that should be respected. If a state doesn't want it, that should be respected. That's part of federalism, is allowing the states to make those decisions. And I think it's critical that the federal government follows the law. I'm glad you filed that lawsuit. This Obama administration is lawless, and we need a federal government that follows the law. When the president takes an oath of office, that oath is to defend, preserve, and protect the Constitution of the United States, and it is an obligation under the Constitution to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And so if I'm elected president, the federal government will once again follow the law and not be breaking contracts, not be violating federal law, but rather honoring the law.
The third question under this area of questions, I joined Texas and 26 other states on challenging the president's, basically his regulatory amnesty plan, amnesty by regulation through his executive action. We're winning that war as of this time, but what would you do? And you already touched on this in the last question, but real quick, tell us what you would do to solve or address the illegal immigration problem.
Yeah, and let me not skip over the Gitmo question real quickly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But listen, on Gitmo, this president, what he is doing is profoundly irresponsible. He is releasing dangerous terrorists. I think he wants to close Gitmo before he leaves, which I think makes no sense whatsoever. These terrorists are returning to the theater of battle. You know, I don't know how you look in the eyes of a mom or dad who lost their son or daughter trying to capture these terrorists in the first place after you turn around and release them, and we're going to have to send yet more of our sons and daughters to capture them or kill them because they've once again returned to waging jihad against America. In my view, not only should we not close Gitmo, but we ought to expand it. I'd like to see as many terrorists as possible take up permanent residence in Gitmo.
Immigration.
So on immigration is a national security priority. And you know, on immigration, I think immigration is actually a good example of all of these different issues. Listen, all of us have discovered politicians who say one thing and do another. And the test that I think we should apply is show me. As the scriptures say, you shall know them by their fruits. So in this Republican presidential primary, every candidate says he opposes amnesty. Every candidate says he opposes illegal immigration and that he's for securing the borders. I think what we should say is, okay, show me your record. And the moment that mattered, there was what Reagan would call a time for choosing. And it was in 2013 when Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid pushed a massive amnesty plan. And a number of establishment Republicans made the decision to go and stand side by side with Barack Obama and Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer. That amnesty plan, it was the Rubio-Schumer amnesty plan. It didn't secure the borders. It made it easier for Obama to allow Syrian refugees into this country without mandating any meaningful background checks. And it would have granted amnesty to 12 million people here illegally and put them on a path to citizenship. Now, when that fight was being waged, I stood shoulder to shoulder with Jeff Sessions and Steve King and millions of Americans, and we said, no, we don't want amnesty. We don't want to undermine the rule of law. We want to keep this country safe. And because millions of Americans rose up, we defeated the Rubio-Schumer amnesty plan in the U.S. Congress. If you want to know how to solve the problems of immigration and illegal immigration, I would encourage you, you can go to our website. It's tedcruz.org. I've got a very, very detailed white paper. It's 11 pages long, single space, chapter and verse, how we solve this problem. We'll start by building a wall, and I've got someone in mind to build it. We'll triple the Border Patrol. We'll increase fourfold the fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. We'll put in place a strong E-Verify system so you can't get a job unless you can prove you're here legally. We'll put in place a biometric exit-entry system on visas because 40% of illegal immigration are visa overstays, and we need to deport them if they overstay their visa. We end sanctuary cities, and the way we do that is we cut off their federal taxpayer money, and we end welfare benefits for those here illegally. And the important point on all of this, look, the media says over and over again, we can't solve this problem. That's not true. They say a wall doesn't work. Really, go to Israel. Take a look at the wall there. When you got terrorists crossing over from Gaza, a wall that is manned works very well and shuts it down. The problem is that the Democrats and far too many Republicans don't have the political will to get it done. They're not willing to solve it. So the media does these cute lines like they say, well, if you build a 10-foot wall, people will come with 11-foot ladders. It's a cute line, but it's not true. And if you have a wall, and if you've tripled the Border Patrol, and if you have fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft, you can monitor someone when they're attempting an incursion. And by the way, it ain't that hard to see a guy carrying an 11-foot ladder. And one of the simplest differences between me and every other candidate on the Republican side is that I am the only candidate who has a proven record of standing and fighting against amnesty. And if elected president, I give you my word, we will secure the borders and we will end illegal immigration.
Okay. So a lot of these people have been here all day and they know what's coming next. I always love to recognize those men and women who serve in uniform, both in the military and law enforcement and first responders, not just the cops, the other first responders. So if you have ever served in the military or are serving in the military or related to someone serving in the military, if you've ever been in law enforcement or a first responder or related to anyone who's been in law enforcement or a first responder, would you please clap loudly? Okay. This is to illustrate your audience and the next question that Oran will ask you.
Yeah, every single day across the country, men and women in law enforcement risk their lives. Every single day in the world, our military soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are risking their lives. I'm not sure that our police and law enforcement and first responders and our military enjoy the respect that they deserve or that they should receive, and that seems to be coming from the top.
Yes.
What can we do to restore that respect?
Oran, you're exactly right. One of the most shameful things we've seen in the last 7 years has been the demonization and vilification of law enforcement. It started early on. You remember with the beer summit, where the president, this Harvard professor, was arrested, and the president immediately sided with a professor over law enforcement and said the police officer was stupid and foolish. That set the opening tone, and for 7 years what we've seen over and over again is the president and attorney general always sides against law enforcement. They always side with the criminals, with the looters, with the hooligans, instead of the people who are risking their lives to keep us safe. You know, I think one of the saddest moments of that was President Obama nominated to be the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, a lawyer who had voluntarily represented for free a cop killer, had given his time for free, free of charge, and had lionized this cop killer as a persecuted hero. And President Obama thought someone who voluntarily gives his time to work for a cop killer was a good person to be a senior official at the U.S. Department of Justice. I helped lead the fight against that nomination, and even in the Democratic, Harry Reid-controlled Senate, that was too much, and the Senate refused to confirm that nominee. And you see, instead, the president, he chooses to divide us on racial lines. So we see, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the astonishing things about just how extreme the Democratic Party has become is that Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are unwilling to utter the words, "All lives matter." Listen, every one of us is a creation of God Almighty. We are precious in God's sight. And if they're not even willing to say that, that shows just how extreme they are. But I'll tell you, the president's vilification of law enforcement, some of the people hurt the most by it are the African American communities. If you look, for example, the city of Baltimore, when you had the riots, when the president immediately sided against the police officers, the month of July following those riots, there were 45 murders in the city of Baltimore. It was the bloodiest month in Baltimore in decades. 43 of those who were murdered were African American. You want to talk about Black Lives Matter? You got 43 black lives that were taken, and one of the significant factors of that is when you attack the police for doing their jobs, they pull back, they're afraid to do their jobs, and the people that suffer the most are those in the communities that are plagued by violence. Those are typically minority communities, African American communities, Hispanic communities. And as I travel the country and visit with law enforcement, one of the things that I tell police officers and firemen and first responders over and over again is, number one, thank you for risking your life for us, but number two, on January 2017, it is going to change, and you are going to have a president that stands unapologetically with law enforcement. You will have a president that has your back.
A slogan that we have used at Palmetto Family Council and Palmetto Family Alliance has been that we're about defending and strengthening families. And this is a question related to that, and it may be the hardest question I have for you because it's one that I can't figure out the answer to. We do pretty well at defending families. If there's a bad piece of legislation, or if there's a good piece of legislation, or if there's some litigation that needs to be done, we're pretty good at that. But strengthening families in South Carolina and in America, fatherhood, motherhood, parenting, the relationship between parents and children, we're still not able to crack that nut in America. And I'm wondering, do you think the person in the Oval Office has a way of doing that? And how would you contrast the current occupant of the Oval Office and how you might do that?
Yeah, look, it is a great question, and one of the things that breaks our heart is we've seen the breakdown of the family and the consequences of the breakdown of the family, and that has been a problem that has plagued this country across this country. And no, a president alone can't solve that problem. Much of that problem has to be solved in the church. It has to be solved in the community. It has to be solved in the family. It has to be solved by touching and changing people's hearts and lives. And government is not going to be the answer to that. It's not going to be Washington that solves it. I do think, though, that government policies have contributed to the breakdown of the family. You look at government policies, for example, you look at our broken welfare system. You are doing nobody a favor when you have government policies that penalize marriage, that make it that you get more money staying as a single mom than you do if you marry the father of your child. That makes no sense, and we need to end the federal government policies that put financial disincentives to marriage. You know, the best cure for poverty is a stable two-person family of a mother and a father. And related to that are policies that trap people in dependency. You're not doing anyone a favor when you keep them trapped on government welfare. You know, I think of all of these issues from the perspective of my dad. You know, my dad fled Cuba in 1957. He'd been imprisoned. He'd been tortured in Cuba. And when he came to America, he had nothing. He had $100 in his underwear. He couldn't speak English. He washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And I've said a lot of times, when my dad was a teenage immigrant washing dishes, thank God some well-meaning liberal didn't come put his arm around him and say, let me take care of you, let me give you a government check, let me make you dependent on government, let me sap you of your self-respect and your dignity and your self-worth. And by the way, while I'm at it, don't bother learning English. I respect your culture so much, I'm going to trap you out of the educated and professional classes in this country. That would have been the most damaging thing you could have done to my dad. You look at what Barack Obama has done, the lawlessness. One of the lawless things he did is he lawlessly waived the work requirement in welfare. As president, I will reinstate the work requirement for welfare. And you know, Oran, it's important for us as conservatives to explain the reason for doing that is not primarily the cost. It's not that we're cheap and don't want to spend the money. The reason for doing that is that when you, look, I think the social safety net should be a trampoline and not a hammock. Look, all of us get down on our luck. All of us encounter hard times, and we have a system that can help you there, but the central focus of the welfare system should be to get you back on your feet, to get you back working, back providing for your family, having the dignity of seeing your kids and providing for food, providing for your family, and that helps bring families together and strengthen them when the parents can get a job, can put food on the table, can provide for them, and you don't have the federal government trapping them instead in a culture of dependency.
So I'm about to pivot, but before I pivot from the family question to another question that has a direct impact on the family, I learned this evening how you see yourself in your family. It's very similar to how I see myself in my family. And you know where I'm about to say. I was in the back room calling my wife, got her voicemail, was going to leave a voicemail message, saw Senator Cruz, thought it would be cool, presidential candidate, leave a voicemail with your wife's. So I hand him the phone, and he says, "Hi, Jennifer, this is Heidi Cruz's husband." So you know your place, Senator.
Indeed, and my response to Heidi is, ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and no excuse, ma'am, right? So the next question is about the environment. And under the environment, the EPA, which is the regulatory agency for the federal government, it is promulgating regulations and policies that are raising the cost of living in a family, raising the utility rates, the energy costs for families, and the cost to run businesses. It is making it difficult for small businesses and families throughout this country. You look at the President's Clean Power Plan. Yep. One of my favorites is the Waters of the U.S. rule, which basically seeks to define a ditch in your backyard the way they would regulate the Mississippi River. Yep. So my question is, we're all conservatives, and conservatives want to conserve the environment. But at the same time, we also recognize that there's a need to balance a livable environment with the cost of regulations on businesses and families. As president, how would you strike that balance between the cost of regulations and having a livable environment?
Great question, very important question. Let me take each piece of it. You mentioned the president's so-called Clean Power Plan. It'd be the most expensive regulations that have ever come out of the federal government, could cost literally tens of millions of jobs, driving up the energy and power bills for every person here in this room. Now, I want to take a minute and congratulate you, Alan, because South Carolina and Texas and a number of other states have filed litigation challenging this rule, and just a few days ago, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an order preventing these rules from going into effect and taking away millions of people's jobs. And as the young lady in the front row just pointed out a second ago, it was 5-4. One more justice, and the whole thing goes away. That underscores the stakes of it. If you look at the Waters of the United States rule, it is another incredibly costly, lawless power grab. And you know, we talked a minute ago about President Obama's abuse of executive power. What he's done wrong with that principally is that he's intruding into the Article I lawmaking authority of Congress. That under the Constitution, all legislative authority is vested in the Congress. That means the president doesn't have the power to make the law, to change the law, or ignore the law. That being said, the president has robust authority under Article II of the Constitution. All executive power is vested in one president of the United States. And if you look at the entire regulatory state, these armies of unelected bureaucrats that issue all these rules, that represents over the decades Congress's efforts to rein in the Article II executive power of the presidency. And the sad dynamic we've got right now when it comes to regulations, when Democrats are in power, regulations grow exponentially. When Republicans are in power, regulations still grow. They just grow a little more slowly. You know, a friend of mine suggested a bumper sticker. Republicans, we waste less. You know, not exactly a banner to march into battle under. We have never seen a president willing to use the full Article II executive power of the presidency to go after the regulatory state, to fire regulators, to go after the EPA, to stop the job-killing regulations. When it comes to the Waters of the United States rule, I will rescind the Waters of the United States rule.
We're in the last two questions.
One of the core principles of Palmetto Family, and it's represented by the stars around our palmetto tree here, is the principle of stewardship, as in stewardship of God's creation. Some of those concepts that were developed so well by the English theologian and statesman William Wilberforce. We believe that the natural resources we have were given by God for us to enjoy, but we shouldn't exploit them or harm His creation unnecessarily. So when it comes to energy, on the subject of energy, what do you think about renewable sources of energy? Should we as Christians encourage clean alternatives for energy, like University of South Carolina has a hydrogen research study, hydrogen, solar, wind, other types of energy like that?
Well, listen, you are absolutely right that we are commanded to be good stewards of the earth. And you know, every one of us wants, for example, clean air and clean water. You know, all of us breathe, all of us drink water, and we would like our kids and grandkids to be able to do so as well. So there is an important role for government in ensuring that we have clean air and clean water. Listen, we saw just recently in Flint, Michigan, the tragic consequences when government fails its basic obligation to ensure that there's clean drinking water available. The problem we're seeing at the federal regulatory level is the EPA under Barack Obama. They're not focused on clean air and clean water. These are zealots that are focused on shutting down development, killing jobs, and they are radicals. They're not protecting the environment. They're simply imposing more and more burdens on people living their lives and providing for their families. That zealotry has to end. Now, with respect to alternative fuels, my view on fuels is that God has blessed this country with abundant resources. We ought to pursue all of the above, every one of those energy sources, whether it's oil and gas, or coal, or wind, or solar, or biofuels, or ethanol. We ought to pursue them all. But I don't think that Washington should be picking winners and losers, and there should be no mandates and no subsidies for anybody. And you know, Oran, I'll make an interesting point on this front. We just saw a couple of weeks ago something really without precedent, which is that when I was campaigning in Iowa, I campaigned foursquare against the ethanol mandate. Now, everyone said that was political suicide. Listen, that's like campaigning in the state of South Carolina and trying to mandate that everyone wear a New York Yankees jersey. Which I'm not doing, by the way. I'm not crazy. But it was, I mean, they grow a lot of corn in Iowa. What's interesting is my two leading competitors, Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, both attacked me for opposing the ethanol mandate. Both of them promised, we'll continue the cronyism, we'll continue the corporate welfare. One of them, Donald, actually promised to expand it. He said, we're going to increase the ethanol mandate. If we can buy some votes doing that, we'll do that. The sitting governor, a Republican, publicly came out against me, told the people of Iowa, vote for anybody but Cruz. The entire rest of the field, these guys will all keep the cronyism going. That guy will actually end it and stop it. The governor's son is a big ethanol lobbyist. Funny how that works. Ran millions of dollars of attack ads against me in that race, and yet the people of Iowa did something extraordinary, which is they rose up and said, our kids are more important, our future is more important, our country is more important, and we won Iowa with the largest vote total of Republicans in the history of the Iowa caucuses.
A video, you can watch it over there.
Our final question is not in the form of a question. We want to show you a video, and if you haven't seen it, you've seen many like it. But we want you to react to what you see, and if you look above, you can see that video.
We've been very good at getting cars on the road because we know that, so I'm not going to crush that part. I'm going to basically crush below, I'm going to crush above, and I'm going to see if I can get it intact. A lot of people want intact parts these days because they're looking for specific nodes. AV nodes, SA. I was like, wow, I didn't even know. Good for them. Yesterday was the first time she said people wanted lungs. And then, like I said, always as many intact livers as possible. Yeah, that would definitely get people to say, I'll do it for the same price and I'll do that.
Oh, look, that video is horrifying. And I've watched the other videos in that series, each of which seems more horrifying than the one before it. I mean, you see senior Planned Parenthood officials laughing, sipping Chardonnay, casually, callously, heartlessly selling the body parts of unborn children. One of the subsequent videos, you see a senior Planned Parenthood official saying she hopes she can sell enough body parts to buy a Lamborghini. I'll tell you, those videos I have urged, I think every American should watch those videos. Even if, and in fact, especially if you consider yourself pro-choice. You should watch those videos and just ask the question, are those my values? Now, in watching those videos, we're horrified. But at the same time, it leads to a natural question, what are we going to do about it? Because shining the light on the barbarity of Planned Parenthood gives an opportunity for us to ask, okay, is action going to follow words? Now, for one thing, those videos appear to be a confession that Planned Parenthood is violating federal law. It is a federal criminal offense, a felony, with up to a 10-year jail term to sell the body parts of unborn children for a profit. On those videos, it appears to be essentially a video confession. The Obama Department of Justice is so politicized that nobody in a million years thinks they would ever begin to even open an investigation or look at Planned Parenthood because they're a political ally of the president's. And so it doesn't matter if they happen to be a national ongoing criminal enterprise violating the federal criminal laws. Now, I'm an alumnus of the Department of Justice. I used to be an associate deputy attorney general at the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice has for years been blind to politics and ideology. It has simply enforced the law. It's why I pledged on day one, I am going to instruct the Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood and to follow the law and prosecute any criminal violations. Amen. But let me say a second thing, because that video highlights a difference. Listen, in the Republican primary, everyone is going to tell us they're pro-life. That's what you say in a Republican primary. You say you're pro-life, especially in a state like South Carolina or a state like Texas. And I think the test we need to apply is show me. Show me where you've stood and fought to defend the right to life. And I would note there is a marked difference between my record in this regard and the other candidates running. Donald Trump has spent the first 60 years of his life describing himself as very, very pro-choice and supporting partial birth abortion. Donald Trump right now, as a candidate for president, still supports taxpayer funding for Planned Parenthood. He says he thinks Planned Parenthood does some wonderful things and our federal taxpayer dollars should go to Planned Parenthood. I disagree with Donald on that. That is a policy issue on which we have a sharp, sharp disagreement. And I would note that my friend Marco Rubio has spoken out against Planned Parenthood. But when these videos came out, I stood with millions of Americans calling on Republican leadership to use the power of Congress to defund Planned Parenthood, to cut off the money. And Marco stood up and said, no, we shouldn't use our constitutional authority to defund Planned Parenthood. That's a mistake. So he and I disagreed on that. I believe if we had leaders that were committed to it, that would stand together and say, we're not going to send $500 million of taxpayer funds to Planned Parenthood, we could have defunded Planned Parenthood in the wake of those videos. But too many Republicans in Washington, especially leadership, were afraid to stand and fight. And I think that's the most basic determination the people of South Carolina has. Is forget the campaign promises. Who's walked the walk? Who has been a consistent conservative? Who do we know we can trust to stand with us on life, on marriage, on religious liberty, on the Second Amendment, on amnesty, on Obamacare, on Supreme Court justices? The stakes are too high, I believe, to get this wrong. And it's why I am so thrilled, so gratified that South Carolina has the critically important role it does, because I think the good people of this state are very, very good at distinguishing the wheat from the chaff, at distinguishing empty campaign promises from a proven record. And I'm grateful to be here to ask for each of your support, to ask for each of your prayers, and for asking to each of you not only to come out on February 20th, but to bring your friends, bring your families, sit down on the phone and call like your country depends upon it, because I believe your country does, and we're either going to pull this country back from the brink, or we risk losing the greatest country in the history of the world.
All right. I don't want to get in trouble with your campaign, because I know they got to get you to your next event. But he said I was going to give him 1 or 2 minutes just to give his closing statement to you. But we had a private conversation, Oran and me, with all of these people. So I can't tell you what it was about, but I can tell you one thing. We asked a question, and the question was, how many people here are still trying to make up their mind? And a fairly significant number raised their hand that they came here today to try to make up their mind. So this is your closing argument, Senator. The stage is yours, and here's your opportunity to petition.
Well, Alan, Oran, thank you very much for hosting this. Thank you for asking these important questions, and thank you all for staying and taking all the time to be here and vet the candidates. Look, I think it is one of the most important parts of this process to look you in the eyes, to answer the hard questions. And we keep getting burned. Every one of us, we keep electing politicians who say one thing and do another. And they don't follow through and do what they said they would do. And I think the stakes are too high for that to happen again. Now, as you know, in the final week before the primary, you're going to see all manners of attacks come out, millions of dollars of attack ads, and as it gets closer, it's going to get nastier and nastier and nastier, and they get personal, they get ugly. The determination I would encourage each of you to make is to examine the records, to examine where each of the candidates have stood, not what they say on the campaign trail, but where have they stood defending life? Where have they stood defending marriage? Where have they stood defending religious liberty, defending the Bill of Rights, defending the Second Amendment, stopping amnesty, securing the borders, repealing Obamacare, and keeping this country safe? Where have they stood standing unshakably with the nation of Israel? Where have they stood standing up to Iran and radical Islamic terrorism? We have been so blessed here in South Carolina. We've got an amazing team of grassroots volunteers. We've got roughly 10,000 volunteers. We have over 300 pastors. who have signed up to volunteer to support our campaign. And I would say, I ask each of you to stand with us. And the final thing I would ask of you is that you pray, that you commit to lift this country up and pray, even just 1 minute a day from now to Election Day, that you simply pray, Father God, please continue this awakening. Continue this spirit of revival, that we might awaken the body of Christ and pull back from the abyss. Because we're here tonight and we're standing on the promises of 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear their prayers from heaven and will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. A bit of history that our friends in the mainstream media will never share with you. In January 1981, when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, his left hand was resting on 2 Chronicles 7:14. A very real and concrete manifestation of that promise from the Word of God. We have faced these challenges before. We have faced the abyss before, and the people of this country rose up and pulled this country back. We have done it before. And if we stand together, we can do it again. Thank you.